Another piece of evidence that you might employ is an example or an illustration. Examples are specific instances that validate your facts or conclusions. And illustrations are narratives that add more drama and emotional involvement to your message. Examples and illustrations should only be used if they meet a couple of simple criteria. First of all, you need to make sure that they are typical or representative of what normally occurs. It's not good to use an example that is an aberration from the norm. If something normally happens and then you get somebody who had a divergent experience and you use them as your example of what will happen to somebody who does the same thing, you're not making a logical argument. The normal occurrence is X, but the thing that this person experienced is Y. And if you use them as an example, you're using an example that is not representative of what normally occurs. So it doesn't support your fact claims. As a matter of fact, it'll mislead your audience. Also, make sure that your example or illustration is significant and clearly has a clear impact on the argument. Sometimes, and you may have noticed this with preachers, sometimes preachers bring up an illustration and they get so far away from their main point that you have a hard time tying it back to the main point. Don't do that with your examples and illustrations. Make sure they're clear, they're succinct, and they have an impact on the argument that you're making. Also, make sure that you don't use an example or illustration that's surrounded by controversy. The last thing you want to do is turn your audience away from you or close their ear to what you're saying because of the example or illustration that you use. Stay away from politically divisive illustrations. Stay away from things that are socially controversial. And then finally, the example or illustration needs to come from a reliable source, one that has credibility with your audience. And one way you can damage your ethos, your credibility, is by using sources that your audience doesn't consider to be credible. It's guilt by association. You don't want to do that. So make sure that if you're using examples and illustrations, you draw them from credible sources. The fourth piece of evidence that you may use is a testimony. Now, only use a testimony if the source is a recognized expert and has no stake in the issue. In other words, he's not biased. Again, credibility. This is about your credibility. It's about the credibility of your source. The testimony should always be consistent with the statements of other people who have experienced. We're back to the whole use an example that is divergent from the normal experience. So if you get one expert who disagrees with 99 other experts and you use him for your testimonial, you're undermining your credibility and you may be misleading your audience. So you want to get a testimony that's consistent with the statement of other experts. And you also want to make sure that the testimony you use is not in contradiction to something that the source has previously said. So if you get a source who is changing their view or says one thing here and says another thing there, using that what they said to support your argument can undermine your argument rather than enhance it. So you need to be sure, if you're going to use testimonies, that your source is credible. This is the underlying foundation for all of your fact claims. You want to make sure, first of all, that you have credibility, and you want to make sure the evidence that you use is credible. Now, after you've presented evidence, then you make inferences. An inference, as we've already discussed, is a conclusion that we draw based on the facts that we have presented. It helps you connect the dots for your audience, demonstrating how the facts that you're using support the position that you are proposing. And this is where things can get sideways. If you're not careful, you can end up hurting or damaging your argument rather than helping your argument in your inferences. We're going to talk a little bit later about logical fallacies at the very end of this lecture. But you need to make sure that your inferences are valid inferences. When you infer something, make sure that you're not using a logical fallacy to get there. So evaluate the inferences critically. Make sure you look at them. Consider how you're using them. Consider what they're saying. Consider the logic that lies behind them. Make sure there's not a flaw in your logic, and make sure that they have a high probability of truth. You can infer things that you can't necessarily prove to be true, but you can infer things that have a high probability of being true. Make sure that you come up on that high probability end of the spectrum, not to infer something that is probably not the case. You might can draw the inference, but it's probably not the case. Don't do that. So I may say that a cat is a mammal, and I am a mammal, and so I could infer that I am a cat. But guess what? I'm not a cat, and so that's a bad inference. It's a logical fallacy. So you want to make sure that your inferences have a high probability of truthfulness. You're trying to lead your audience to the conclusion, to the persuasive conclusion that you want them to reach. You're presenting an argument. You want to make sure that just like you want to make sure your facts are credible, you want to make sure the inferences that you draw from the facts are credible. Now, logos arguments appeal to reason. It's all about being reasonable. It's all about making a well-reasoned argument. And there's a really good model developed by Stephen Toulmin that'll help you appeal to reason in your arguments. I'm going to promise you, if you look at this model and get a grasp of what it's telling you, it'll improve your ability to argue, your ability to write college papers, your ability to convince audiences and your parents and your siblings and your friends. This is going to help you argue effectively. It's called Toulmin's Reasonable Argument Model. I've included a short link, a link to a short video that you can watch aside from the video that I'm doing here, because I'm not going to go real in depth on it, but I want you to go back and watch that video. It's an English professor out of St. Louis discussing this reasonable argument model, and I think you'll benefit greatly from it. Basically, the model contains 6 parts. First, there's a claim. The claim is the proposition or the thesis that you hope to prove. Secondly, there's data. Data is the reasons, the facts, the evidence for making the claim. Third, there's a warrant. A warrant is a logical and persuasive relationship that explains how you get to the claim from the data. This is where you make your inference. And then there's the backing. The backing consists of supporting information that strengthens the warrant when the warrant is controversial. So you've got a claim, you've got data, you've got a warrant, and then you back up your warrant. This piece helps strengthen your warrant. And then fifth, there is a qualifier. A qualifier places limitations on the connections between the data and the warrant. You want to make sure that you understand exactly what it is you have and what the limits are to it. And then the last piece is a rebuttal, and a rebuttal addresses potential counter arguments. Go back and watch the video. You'll benefit from it. It'll help you in your persuasive speech. The Toulmin Reasonable Argument Model. There are 4 methods of reasoning that you can use to argue for your position. The first is deductive reasoning, and that's used when you move from a general idea to a specific point. It takes the form of syllogisms or patterns that structure your argument. A syllogism has 3 parts: a major premise, which is the general statement of truth; a minor premise, which is a minor or a more specific statement that describes a claim made about a particular object; and then a conclusion, which is the combination of the major and minor premise. It's what emerges from that. The major and the minor premise must both be true in order for the conclusion to follow logically from the premise. And so you should always make sure that you're dealing with factual information. This is deductive reasoning. You start broad with the general statement, and then you make a more specific statement. Both need to be true. Both need to be connected. You always present the major premise first, and then you come down to the more specific minor premise, and then you draw your conclusion from the two. That is deductive reasoning. Inductive reasoning goes the other way around. It begins with a specific observation or multiple specific observations and moves to a more general claim or conclusion. And when you're using inductive reasoning, you have to determine if there are enough reasons given to justify your conclusion. So you start with little pieces and you put together enough little pieces, and from those little pieces you can infer a bigger piece. And so that's what you're doing with inductive reasoning. You're citing examples that are typical and representative of the whole population, and you're drawing from those multiple examples a larger conclusion. That's inductive reasoning. Causal reasoning unites two or more events to illustrate that one or more caused the other. I ran out of gas and I was late for work. I was late for work because I ran out of gas. Don't run out of gas or you may be late for work. There's causal reasoning. Now, causal reasoning is very dangerous ground. Be careful when you argue from cause. There has to be a valid link between the cause and the result, or you'll fall into a logical fallacy. You may say that Ben took his date to Waffle House, and Sally broke up with Ben the next day. And you may infer that if you ever take your date to Waffle House, she's going to break up with you. And that inference is false. There's no connection, hopefully, between Waffle House and Sally. Sally just didn't like Ben's attitude or something else. I don't know. There are a lot of other reasons why Sally may have broken up with Ben. So causal reasoning will get you in trouble. Be careful when you argue from cause. The fourth one is reasoning from analogy. That occurs when you compare two like things and conclude that because they are comparable in one way or in some ways, they are then also comparable in other ways. For example, a student made a bad grade on a paper, and in the past, other students had made a bad grade on this same paper in the same class. But those students, when the professor referred them to the on-campus writing center, and they went there for help, when they wrote the next paper in the class, their scores improved dramatically. And so you may argue to the student that you're no different than those other students. You may have not done well on this paper, but if you'll go visit the writing center and let them help you, you'll get the same results that those other students got. That's reasoning from analogy.